welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and how did I become such a great deck builder? Let's tell the tale of how that occurred. I mean, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back too hard, but I am a pretty good deck builder, and I think it's an interesting journey that I went on to get there, especially in the Commander format because of the way I build decks. And as I tell you this tale, you will see how I sort of got the direction I went into. This is not necessarily a Commander video. This is actually very different than anything I've ever done. My channel is EDH Deck Building. The EDH part isn't going to apply a whole lot here. The deck building part very much is, of course, because that's exactly what I'm talking about in this video. And it is an important part of my channel, right? The big part of my channel since the beginning is not just, hey, here's a bunch of decks because I build a lot. That is something I do on my channel, obviously. But it's also, I'm trying to teach the methods that I use for deck building because it sort of is becoming a little bit of a lost art in the game of Magic, and more people need to be doing it. It's one of the reasons why I love the Commander format so much, is because that's a format where it happens a lot more than I think it probably does in a lot of other formats. It's one of the things that drew me to the format in the first place. So how did I get here? Well, let's go back way, way back to 1997. That's when I first started playing this game, the game of Magic, and I was not doing it correctly. The guy that taught me how to play Magic didn't really teach me any of the rules. There really was no rules at all other than the actual mechanics of the game. We used to play with these giant decks. We did not know there was a limit to the amount of cards you could have in your deck. So my buddy who played a Dimir deck would have like 30 counterspells in his deck, and I'm not even exaggerating. He actually had the card counterspell. He had like 30 cards in there. We would play these giant games, very similar to Commander, funny enough. There'd be four of us. We'd all be sitting at a table together. We'd have these giant stacks, like 150, 200 card decks, because again, we didn't know there was a limit to the amount of cards you could have in your deck. We didn't even know there was such a thing as a format. And we'd just go nuts. We'd have these long, like 2-hour games. Again, very similar to Commander, funny enough. That's how I played Magic for about the first year that I played the game. And I had a very different way of thinking about how the game worked. I played white-green. That was my first deck. And just like those big creatures, right? Those big stompy creatures that I could close out games with, that made sense to me, right? I want to reduce my opponent's life total to 0. I want those big creatures in play. About a year after I started playing, I moved to the big city, right? I did not have an LGS where I lived. I lived out in the sticks where there was no other people to play with other than my friends, and my friends learned how to play Magic from me. I taught them. So, the fallacies in the game and in the way we played and the way we built decks sort of just traveled down to everybody else. Once I moved to the big city, I went to my local gaming store, and there's people playing in the back like there typically is. And I was super excited. I get to play against different people finally. Sat down, little like 14-year-old kid maybe sitting across from me. And I'm like, I'm going to show him who's boss. First turn, he plays a Carnophage. And I was like, what? That card's awful. I was like, it's just a 2/2 creature. And it has, on your upkeep, you lose 1 life. Like, what? Is he serious with this? That's an awful creature. Wait till he sees my Rootbreaker Worm, right? That was my thinking. Oh, wait till I get my Rootbreaker Worm out. He's going to be, like I discovered, big creatures hit hard or something. I had this weird way of thinking where I'm like, hey, bigger creature equals better creature, right? That was my way of thinking. I thought this Carnophage awful. And of course, anyone who remembers Standard back then, the Carnophage was probably the best creature in Standard at the time. A lot of people were playing decks like that. And of course, as the game progressed, I'm just like, oh, here comes that Rootbreaker Worm, just 4 more turns. But of course, my life total is starting to be reduced lower and lower and lower. And now I'm like, wait, what's going on here, right? And of course, before I could even get to 7 mana, I was dead. And I was like, what just happened? Like, I thought I was in the Twilight Zone. I'm like, wait, this is not how Magic's supposed to work. It was such a massive revelation for me. And I know telling the story, people are like, well, obviously, but just the way we played Magic, the way I played with my friends, it just never occurred to me that, hey, I could just get out a 1/1 creature or a Jackal Pup or something early in the game and start hammering my opponent's life total away so that before he gets that big creature out, he's already dead, right? That just never occurred to me and my friends because we were all about playing those big, scary creatures, right? It just made sense to us. A lot of things didn't make sense to me when I first started. Like Wasteland, that was a card that I must have had 20 of those, cracked them open in packs. I thought it was awful. I was like, why would you ever play that card? How am I supposed to cast my Rootbreaker Worm when I sacrifice my own land? I want to get lots of lands into play, right? So it's things like that. Again, that was such a massive revelation for me about how the game actually works. So, of course, I had to go back to the drawing board. I like learning new things, and I certainly don't like losing, so I go back to the drawing board, and now I'm going to start making a new deck. And we are now in Urza Saga Standard, right? This is when Urza Block starts coming out. I see the card Phyrexian Colossus. I crack it open in a pack, and I fell in love with it immediately because I still like those big creatures. I'm not shying away from that. It's 7 mana, and it's an 8/8. So now I'm like, okay, this is Rootbreaker Worm territory, 7 mana, but I'm getting an 8/8 creature that is essentially unblockable, which is fantastic. I loved the art too. The art is amazing. And I so badly wanted to use this card. But again, I've learned so much that I need to, okay, I can't just play these big stompy creatures anymore. So I basically, funny enough, it was almost like building a commander deck where I really badly wanted to play this creature and I had to figure out a way to make it good. So it's funny how things come full circle here. I figured out 2 ways to make it good. The first way to make it good was Copper Gnomes, right? Which also came out in the same set. Pay for and sacrifice it to put an artifact from your hand into play. So I'm cheating my Phyrexian Colossus into play. I'm like, okay, there we go. We're off to this is like the first combo I ever actually came up with. The other part of there's 3 parts to this combo. It's not really a combo, but you know what I mean? It's just synergy, right? This is how the game's actually played, but I thought I had discovered this great combo. Funny enough, Tinker also went into that deck because, of course, that got my Phyrexian Colossus into play even faster, but of course that got banned almost immediately because that card was ridiculous. The other part of the deck, essentially, the deck was built around 3 cards, Mind Over Matter being the other one, because of course, Phyrexian Colossus has this horrible downside where I got to pay 8 life to untap it because it doesn't untap during my untap step. So I'm like, hey, I could put Mind Over Matter in there, and all I have to do is discard a card and untap my Phyrexian Colossus, right? So now I'm on to something here, right? This was my first real deck that I put together. It was mono blue, just Copper Gnomes. I cheat my Phyrexian Colossus into play, and I untap it with Mind Over Matter. And I thought, okay, well, I'm discarding cards a lot, so my hand's getting really empty. And I came across this card, Windfall, and I'm like, hey, there's a great way to refill my hand. And, you know, a lot of people might be, again, if you're familiar with this era of Magic, you might be saying, hey, well, he's sort of talking about the Tellurian Academy deck, which, you know, again, I had this really neat idea for this deck built around Phyrexian Colossus. But unfortunately, there's a lot of other people that were building the same idea around Tellurian Academy, where obviously I just used Mind Over Matter to untap my Tellurian Academy, produce a ton of mana, Windfall, you know, that was the Tellurian Academy deck, right? One of the most infamous and most powerful decks ever assembled. And of course, a lot of those cards got banned. And also it made my Phyrexian Colossus deck, which I was so proud of, you know, it paled in comparison. And so again, I had to go back to the drawing board. Funny enough, there was a guy at that LGS who was sort of one of those guys, right? He had lots of money and he was basically net decking before that was really a thing. And he just went out and bought all those cards, right? Immediately, as soon as that deck became a thing, he went out and got the Tellurian Academy deck and put it together and just was stomping everyone at the LGS. So I was very happy when I can't remember exactly, like Tellurian Academy got banned and I think maybe Windfall got banned. And maybe Mind Over Matter got banned. I can't remember exactly which cards got banned. There was like 3 or 4 cards from that deck that got banned. And I was very happy that that happened, although it made my deck a lot worse. So again, I went back to the drawing board. I went back to the drawing board because, of course, my deck was missing some important pieces, but also because this, again, now I'm getting stomped so handily, although I would say it not fairly because that deck is absurdly busted, but I was getting stomped and I didn't like it. So I went a different direction and I was reading Wizard magazine, again, for anyone who remembers that back in the day, and it was talking about different deck types, and I saw this idea of control and control decks, and I like that. You know, I really didn't like losing, and I don't, you know, in life, I don't like not being in control. I don't know if you could call me a control freak, but I like being able to handle any given situation. I don't like a situation being presented in front of me that I can't deal with. And of course, as I talk about on my channel all the time, a way to deal with that, a great way to deal with that is with removal, right? This is sort of where this idea came from. Removal wins games essentially comes from being able to handle every situation that is presented before you, which of course is really, really important in a commander game. So I went to work. I'm still playing in standard at the time, by the way. I played almost only standard for the longest time. So I'm in standard still, and now I'm building a 4-color control deck, and that was tough to do. Back then, playing a deck that was more than 2 colors was really, really tough. There was no fetch lands back then. There was no shock lands back then. Of course, there was dual lands, but they weren't, I mean, they were absurdly expensive, but also not legal in standard, so you couldn't use them. So that was by far the toughest part for me. Also, the tough part was getting Wrath of God. I needed Wrath of Gods because, again, there wasn't a lot of board wipes back then either. Wrath of God was pretty much the only one. Also a really expensive card back then as well for that reason. I think I've told the story on my channel before of I cracked open a Sarah Sanctum in a pack of cards, and of course, expensive card. Everybody wanted one. I didn't want one. I was putting together a 4-color control deck, so I traded it away for a Wrath of God and a Reflecting Pool, which was, again, another expensive card. That was a land that was very, very commonly used back then as a mana fixer because there wasn't a lot of options. City of Brass was the only other option. City of Brass, of course, again, used to be a really expensive card. I managed to get my hands on one of those. I had 1 City of Brass and 1 Reflecting Pool in my 4-color control deck. So my mana base wasn't great, but, I didn't have a lot of money. I was dealing with what I had. Made my 4-color control deck, and I still have an affinity for that deck. It holds a special place in my heart. I talk about Wall of Blossoms and how I love that, one of my favorite creatures, because that was a card I had in that deck, which came down, drew you the card, was a great blocker, worked great in any control theme. My win cons for that deck were Fanning the Flames, the Buyback Fireball, and also Shard Phoenix, another card that's sort of is very nostalgic for me because they were repeatable, right? It was a repeatable way. You could just keep getting them back and back and back. And I know people looking at those cards will go, wow, it must have took you a while to close out the game. You betcha. Yeah, that was not a fast deck. It was very much about controlling what my opponents were doing. No black. It was a red, white, blue, and green deck. And, of course, I had counter spells. I had those disenchants, obviously. I had lots of removal. I imagine is what started me down this whole road of removal wins games, being able to deal with what your opponents are doing. And most importantly, in the first ever actual tournament that I played in, where I played that deck. And funny enough, I played against that guy, the Tellurian Academy guy, the guy who always had the money and the cards, and he just, whatever the most powerful deck at the time was, he just assembled that deck and played it at the local tournament. I was stuck against him in the very first game. And of course, the Tellurian Academy deck was banned at this point. So he went to the next most powerful option, which was the Smokestack deck. And as I've talked about again on my channel a few times, this is where stacks originated, guys. The term stacks comes from the Smokestack deck. It was called the Stacks deck. That's the name of the deck. That's where the term comes from, was the name of that deck. It was built around Smokestack. And that's, again, the term has come to mean other things, but essentially that's what stacks means, is the forcing your opponent to sacrifice all their stuff. That's where it originated anyway. And I don't know how many different variations there was of that deck in standard at the time. He played a mono green version. And of course, as we all know from Commander, what does mono green do really, really well? It puts stuff into play really, really well, right? Green is the best color at just putting stuff onto the board, whether it be lands or creatures or whatever. And that was the deck. He played a mono green Smokestack deck where he just dumped lots of stuff on the board. And of course, as that deck goes, you put the counters on your Smokestack, you sacrifice stuff, but you got lots of stuff. And then you essentially force your opponent to sacrifice everything, their lands included, until they have nothing left. And then, of course, it's easy to close out the game from there. And I went up against him with my 4-color control deck, and we went back and forth, and I was slowing him down a lot. Disenchant his Smokestack, casting board wipes, of course, which wipes out all his creatures, which makes it really hard for him to get going. So now he has to sacrifice his Smokestack to itself because he's not set up enough yet. And it was just back and forth and back and forth. In the end, in the game ended up being a draw. We didn't even get past the first game. There's a time limit, right? You're supposed to play it's best of 3 in, an hour or whatever it is for the time limit. I haven't played in a tournament in forever, but we drew the first game. We never concluded the first game. The first game went forever. And it's one of my proudest moments because that guy who has the most powerful decks, I think very much played into my whole mentality with deck building, but also just Magic in general, where I'm like David versus Goliath. You know, it's you got the guy with the best cards and he's got all the money and he's got all the best everything. And he doesn't really put a whole lot of thought into his decks. He just goes out and buys whatever the best cards are or the best decks, assembles that and does that. And I'm the guy who can only afford one Wrath of God and one Reflecting Pool and one City of Brass, but I managed to assemble a deck that can at least draw the game, right? Not necessarily beat them, but at least draw the game. That I think plays into a lot of just how I play Magic in general for me. And yeah, maybe it's a hipster thing or whatever you want to call it, where I just don't really love playing all the best cards for that reason. Sometimes I avoid playing the best cards for that reason, as I've talked about on my channel before. So that was a huge step in my deck building process, but also how I play the game of Magic. I didn't really play in a lot of tournaments back then. The one though that I was most successful with again, I played in Standard for the longest time, and the most successful deck I ever made, the one that I was really, really proud of, it actually didn't really do the thing that I typically do in Magic in general. It's not the thing that I really like. Again, I didn't really love playing the stacks decks and stuff like that. But I just sort of discovered this little interaction that I thought worked really, really well. And sure enough, I tried it and is the most success I've ever had at a tournament with a deck, and that is my Zozu the Punisher deck. And of course, we're in Kamigawa Standard now, right? This is when Kamigawa came out, and Zozu, 1 red, Goblin Warrior 2/2. When a land enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to that land's controller. And I don't know, just something about that I really, really liked. I just thought, what a neat way to try to win a game. This mentality sort of came in where, what if I punish my opponents for something they're already doing or something they want to be doing? That seems like a really neat way to win the game. And, you know, I'm shuffling through my cards and I'm looking at them, and I also come across Seismic Assault. Again, another card that is very nostalgic for me. I've talked about it a lot on my channel, and this is where my love for it came from. And I started to see a lot of similarities here. Okay, discard a land card, deals 2 damage to any target. So there's a card that wants you to be discarding your lands, and Zozu the Punisher is a card that wants you to be not playing lands, right? If I don't play lands, then it's not going to hurt me. And Seismic Assault costs 3 mana, and Zozu the Punisher costs 3 mana. So the very interesting strategy I came up with is, I mean, it's a Zozu the Punisher Seismic Assault deck, and nothing in my deck costs more than 3 mana. Everything in my deck costs 3 mana, so that I only have to play 3 lands, and then I stop playing lands. And of course, I play my 3 lands, and then I cast my Zozu, and since I'm not playing lands, the Zozu doesn't hurt me. And all the lands that I am now drawing, I discard to my Seismic Assault. Seems like pretty great synergy, right? So that was the deck. It was just a very unique idea. Again, now we're in another sphere of, it's not necessarily, I mean, yeah, it's a strategy and there's lots of synergy here, but the idea of it's how you play the deck, right? That's another really important aspect to deck building is sometimes it's not just, I throw this deck together and it's a really great deck and I can just hand it off to whoever and they can sit down and play the deck. Maybe you don't know how to play the deck, right? How you play the deck also matters. And anyone who took this deck and maybe played it, they're not going to know that they're only supposed to play 3 lands. I mean, you could play the deck just normally and just play as many lands as you want, but I designed the deck. That's why everything in the deck costs 3 or less, because I designed the deck so that I only play 3 lands and then the rest I just discard to my Seismic Assault. That was the deck. It was essentially a Punisher deck, right? It was, I'm punishing my opponents for all these things that they're doing. I had lots of cards like that, but everything costs 3 or less. And that was the most successful. Again, it's not a deck that I definitely don't like mono red. That part I was super not excited about. I'm like, oh man, someone's going to have a circle protection red and I'm going to be screwed, right? They're going to have a circle protection red in their sideboard and I'm going to be screwed. That never happened though. So that's one of the things that was done a lot more back in the day, right? People actually put circular protections in their sideboard. I don't know if anyone does that anymore. I don't think so. But that's the one thing you had to worry about when you're playing a mono red, like a burn deck like that, right? But this was just such a very unique version of that deck, and it worked really, really well. It's the most success I've ever had in Standard, the most successful I've ever had at a tournament. And so it's very nostalgic for me. It's one of my proudest creations, and it's just a very unique way to go about building a deck. Again, it's another sort of phase that I moved on to where, man, I'm even going to build the deck so that you have to play it a specific way in order to make it work. So all of these decks that I've built, not in Commander, right? Again, this is long before I ever started playing Commander. These are all standard decks that really shaped the way that I build decks and helped me to become the deck builder I am. I think I'm a pretty good deck builder. I don't brag about my talents too much, but I think I'm pretty good at it. And this is the direction I took. Again, if you're watching this video for, just a trip down memory lane, or if you're watching this video for, you just like to hear me talk about myself, or maybe you're watching this video because I'm going over the steps that I took to go from, I'm just throwing, giant crawl worm, root breaker worm, all these big dumb creatures in a deck. And then when I finally get up to 7 mana, I can start like just the worst deck building ever, to where I am now. These are the steps that I took. And I think it's pretty interesting. I was thinking about it the other day, and some of these old decks that I built that I was really proud of, that were very significant for me back in the day. And I was thinking, man, that really did make a huge impact on me and how I've become a deck builder today. So there it is, the tale of how I became, I think, a pretty decent deck builder. Hope you enjoyed. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.